She was already sitting there when the door closed behind her, the wooden pew cool through her skirt, her hands folded not in prayer but in habit. Grace had been watching the dust move, in the late light slanting through the stained glass. The way it hovered, almost suspended, as if waiting for permission to settle. She didn't turn when Hannah came in. She knew the sound of her steps. She had known it before she remembered she knew it. The church smelled the same as always. Old varnish, candle wax, a faint trace of damp stone. But something in the air felt slightly disturbed, as though someone had opened a window in another room, and the current had found its way here. Grace kept her gaze forward. Her spine stayed straight. Her breathing did not. Hannah slid into the pew beside her with a carefulness that felt intentional, leaving the smallest space between their arms. Not touching. Almost. Grace noticed the warmth anyway. She always did. It arrived before thought, before judgment, before the quiet internal voice that told her to behave. They sat like that, side by side, the familiar silence of the place wrapping around them. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere near the altar, a candle hissed softly as its wick adjusted. Grace could feel Hannah's presence the way one feels a change in weather. Not dramatic, not sudden, just undeniably there. This was how it had been all afternoon. Hannah had arrived at her parents' house with a soft knock and a smile that seemed both cautious and completely unafraid. She had stayed. That was the problem. She hadn't come with questions or confessions, or the urgency Grace had secretly braced herself for. She had come with time. They had washed dishes together after lunch, standing too close at the sink, Grace rinsing, Hannah drying, their movements finding an old rhythm without discussion. They hadn't talked about anything that mattered. They had talked about the garden fence, about the neighbor's dog, about how the town looked smaller than they remembered. Grace had laughed once, surprised by the sound of it, and Hannah had looked at her then, just briefly, as if committing the moment to memory. Now, in the quiet of the church, Grace's thoughts looped back to that look, the way it had landed and stayed. She had prayed before Hannah arrived. She had prayed while folding laundry, while setting the table, while waiting for the knock. Not for guidance. Not even for forgiveness. Just for it to pass. The feeling, the pull, the way her chest tightened when she imagined Hannah's voice saying her name. Please, she had thought, not even forming the words fully. Just let it go. But Hannah had come back, and nothing had gone. Grace shifted slightly on the pew, adjusting her skirt, a movement she had made 1,000 times in this place. Her fingers brushed the small cross pendant at her throat, tracing its edges without thinking. The metal was warm from her skin. It always was. She wondered, not for the first time, when she had learned to separate the things she felt from the things she was allowed to say. There had never been a single moment. It had been gradual, like learning the rules of a game no one announced. You watched. You listened. You adapted. Beside her, Hannah leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands loosely clasped. Grace caught the faint scent of her shampoo, something clean, unfamiliar. It didn't belong to the town. It didn't belong to the church. It belonged to somewhere else Hannah had been, somewhere Grace had only imagined. She told herself not to look. She looked anyway. Hannah's profile was sharper than Grace remembered, her jaw more defined, her hair cut shorter, falling just above her collarbone. There was an ease to her posture that Grace felt acutely, as if it highlighted her own careful stillness. When Hannah noticed her gaze, she didn't smile. She didn't turn away. She simply held it, her eyes steady, curious, gentle. The moment stretched. Grace felt it in her stomach first, a familiar drop like the beginning of a fall she had learned to anticipate. Her breath caught just slightly. She looked back to the altar, her cheeks warm. This was the friction. Not something said. Something not said. They stayed there longer than necessary. The service had ended earlier. No one else was inside now. The church belonged to them in the way quiet places sometimes do, lending themselves without comment. Grace's thoughts moved in circles. She thought about the prayers she had whispered as a teenager, kneeling in this same spot, asking to be made good. She thought about the nights she had lain awake, cataloging her thoughts the way one catalogs sins, deciding which could be dismissed and which needed penance. She thought about Hannah leaving years ago, the space she had left behind, and how Grace had filled it with work, with responsibility, with expectation. She had believed absence would cure her. She had been wrong. Hannah shifted again, this time crossing one leg over the other. Her knee angled toward Grace, not touching, but close enough that Grace felt the heat of it through the thin fabric of her skirt. The body reacted. A tightening. A soft, involuntary inhale. She pressed her thighs together, grounding herself in the familiar discomfort. She wondered if Hannah noticed. She wondered if Hannah always noticed. Outside, the bell tower rang the hour. The sound moved through the church and out into the town, marking time for people who were not sitting in pews, trying not to feel their own hearts. Grace counted the rings automatically. It was a habit. It helped her stay present. It didn't help enough. When the last echo faded, Hannah spoke, her voice low, as if aware of the acoustics. "Do you want to stay a little longer?" she asked. It wasn't a question about the church. Grace knew that. It was about this moment. This proximity. This unspoken agreement to remain. "Yes," Grace said before she could think better of it. The word left her mouth and settled between them, heavier than it should have been. Hannah nodded, accepting it without comment. She leaned back, resting her shoulders against the pew. Her arm lay along the backrest, not around Grace, but close enough that Grace could see the freckles on her forearm, the faint scar near her wrist she didn't remember from before. Time passed. Grace couldn't say how much. The light shifted again, coloring the floor in deeper hues. Somewhere outside, children laughed. A door closed. Life continued, indifferent and persistent. Grace became aware of her breathing, the rise and fall of it, the way it had synchronized slightly with Hannah's. She hated that she noticed. She loved that she noticed. The two feelings coexisted, inseparable. She thought of her mother's voice, gentle but firm, reminding her of who she was meant to be. She thought of the sermons she had internalized, the ones that spoke of love in abstract terms, stripped of bodies and consequences. She thought of how none of them had prepared her for this. This quiet, this waiting, this devastating normalcy of sitting next to someone and wanting them to stay. Her hand moved again to the cross at her throat. She held it this time, pressing it lightly into her skin. Not in supplication, in recognition. Hannah glanced at the movement, her eyes following Grace's fingers. For a moment, something unreadable crossed her face. Not judgment, not pity, something closer to understanding. "I missed this place," Hannah said softly. Grace swallowed. "I didn't," she replied, and then after a beat, "But I missed how it feels when it's quiet." Hannah smiled then, small and genuine. "Me too." The feeling settled again, familiar and unresolved. The knowledge that Hannah was here, that she was staying, that Grace's prayer had gone unanswered in the most precise way possible. She sat with it, letting it repeat, letting it take up space inside her chest. Hannah is here. Hannah is here. Hannah is here. And nothing, Grace knew with a clarity that frightened her, was passing. The quiet followed them out of the church, not breaking so much as thinning, stretching itself to fit the street, the afternoon, the small distance between their shoulders as they walked. Grace felt it still inside her, the way one feels a sound after it stops ringing. Nothing had been said that needed answering. That was the trouble. Everything remained. They moved side by side without deciding to. It felt natural in a way that made Grace uneasy, as though the years between Hannah's leaving and returning had folded in on themselves and disappeared. The town looked the same. Brick storefronts, faded signs, the bakery on the corner with its door propped open. But Grace noticed details she usually passed without thought. The uneven sidewalk, a chalk drawing near the curb, half smudged by shoes. The way Hannah slowed her pace without looking back, matching Grace's shorter steps. At her parents' house, The afternoon settled into something like routine. Hannah offered to help without ceremony, reaching for a dish towel, rinsing the cups they'd left earlier, wiping the counter as if she had always done so. Grace found herself watching her hands more than necessary, the familiarity of the motion stirring a sense of recognition she didn't know where to place. They worked quietly. The sink ran. A radio murmured from the living room, a talk show Grace's father listened to out of habit rather than interest. The sound filled the spaces between them without asking anything. Grace dried her hands carefully, taking longer than needed, feeling the texture of the towel, the slight roughness against her palms. She wondered distantly if this was how it had begun before, or if it had never begun at all, just existed, unmarked by names or decisions. Hannah leaned against the counter, her hip close enough that Grace could feel it when she turned, a soft contact that neither acknowledged. The contact lingered. Grace didn't move away. She focused instead on the window above the sink, the way the light shifted as clouds passed, the dust on the sill she kept meaning to wipe. Her thoughts grew quieter but sharper, circling fewer things now. Hannah's presence, the way she stayed, the absence of pressure. Grace had prepared herself for questions she didn't want to answer, for confessions she wasn't ready to hear. Instead, Hannah asked nothing. She occupied the space as if that were enough. It made Grace restless in a way she didn't fully understand. Later, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone lukewarm. Grace wrapped both hands around her mug, feeling the heat that remained. Hannah sat across from her, one foot tucked beneath the chair, her knee bouncing slightly, a habit Grace remembered from years ago, from classrooms and bus stops and places they'd waited together. "You still take it the same way," Hannah said, nodding toward the mug. Grace blinked. "What? No sugar," Hannah said. "You never liked it." Grace smiled despite herself, a small reflexive thing. "I forgot you noticed that." Hannah's expression softened. "I noticed a lot." The words landed gently but stayed. Grace felt them settle somewhere behind her ribs, heavy and warm. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. Time moved. The afternoon tilted toward evening. Grace's mother came home, greeting Hannah with polite warmth and questions that stayed safely on the surface. Hannah answered easily, slipping into conversation without effort. Grace watched her from the corner of the room, struck by how well she fit into the space, how little disruption she caused. That, more than anything, frightened her. When her mother went upstairs to change, the house grew quieter again. Hannah stood by the window, looking out at the yard where Grace had spent so many hours growing up, where nothing remarkable had ever happened. Grace joined her without thinking, standing close enough that their arms brushed when she leaned forward. Neither moved away. The contact was brief, accidental, yet Grace felt it echo, a faint hum traveling up her arm. She folded her hands together, clasping them tightly, grounding herself in the familiar pressure. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," Hannah said, still looking outside. Grace followed her gaze, grateful for the distance it provided. "I didn't know either." Hannah turned then, just enough to look at her fully. "And?" Grace hesitated. The answer pressed at the back of her throat, insistent and unwelcome. She chose instead the truth she could manage. "I'm glad you came." Hannah nodded, accepting it without asking for more. The moment held, suspended, before life intervened again. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Her father's voice calling out a greeting. Dinner was a careful affair. Conversation moved around safe topics, stories from Hannah's time away that were interesting but incomplete. Grace listened closely, noticing what Hannah left out as much as what she shared. She felt an unexpected gratitude for the omissions. Afterward, as dishes were cleared and the evening settled in, Grace found herself repeating small gestures without realizing it. Touching the cross at her throat, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth, glancing toward Hannah whenever the room grew quiet. Each repetition anchored her, even as it revealed how unsettled she felt. When Hannah finally stood to leave, the space between them felt suddenly larger, charged. They walked to the door together. Grace held it open, her hand on the knob, delaying the inevitable. I'll see you tomorrow?" Hannah asked, her voice tentative for the first time. Grace nodded. "Yes." The answer came easily. Too easily. Hannah lingered, her hand resting on the doorframe, her body angled toward Grace. For a moment, Grace thought she might say something else. She didn't. She smiled instead, soft and restrained, and stepped outside. Grace watched from the doorway until Hannah reached the sidewalk and turned back once, lifting a hand in a small, familiar wave. Grace returned it, her fingers slow to lower afterward. Inside, the house felt different. Quieter. Fuller. She leaned her forehead briefly against the closed door, breathing in the lingering scent of Hannah's shampoo, the faint warmth she had left behind. She pressed her fingers again to the cross at her throat, holding it there, letting the gesture repeat, steady and unresolved. Tomorrow. 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 The word echoed, neither promise nor warning, just a marker of time moving forward whether she was ready or not. The morning arrived already altered. Grace noticed it before she named it, before she even opened her eyes. Something in her body felt alert, in a way sleep usually softened. Her breath came shallow, attentive, as if she had been listening all night. When she finally sat up, the room looked the same. Pale walls, the familiar dresser, the sliver of light through the curtains. But the air carried weight. Hannah would come today. The knowledge colored everything that followed. The way Grace brushed her teeth, lingering too long at the mirror without quite meeting her own gaze. The way she chose a sweater she rarely wore, softer than practical, then almost changed her mind. The way her fingers hesitated at the cross at her throat before fastening it in place. Nothing had happened yet. And yet, something already had. Downstairs, the house moved through its usual morning sounds. Her mother's footsteps, the kettle heating, a spoon tapping porcelain. Grace joined them, exchanged small talk, moved through routine with a precision that felt deliberate. She was aware of herself in space, of how she stood, how she reached, how she listened. Desire hadn't announced itself loudly. It had simply settled, watchful. When Hannah arrived, it was without ceremony. A knock. A familiar pause. Grace opened the door, and there she was, hair pulled back loosely, eyes bright in a way that felt unguarded. She smiled, and the smile landed somewhere low in Grace's chest, a soft impact that stayed. "Morning," Hannah said. "Morning," Grace replied, her voice steady enough. They stood for a second longer than necessary, neither stepping aside, neither stepping forward. Consent lived there, in the waiting, in the absence of urgency. When Grace finally moved, it was an invitation made through action rather than word. They spent the morning together doing nothing remarkable. Folding laundry at the table, sorting old photographs into piles that didn't mean much. Hannah told a story about a place she'd lived briefly, her voice casual, her hands moving as she spoke. Grace listened, not just to the words but to the space between them, to the way Hannah's knee brushed hers when she leaned forward. The touch was light, almost nothing. It stayed. Grace didn't pull away. She didn't lean in. She let the contact exist, cataloging every sensation as if it might vanish if she didn't. The warmth, the pressure, the awareness that Hannah noticed too. She could tell by the way Hannah stilled, by the way her breath changed just slightly. Inside, Grace's thoughts narrowed. Desire and hesitation sat side by side, neither overpowering the other. She thought of her prayers, of the careful language she had used with God, always asking for guidance without specifying direction. She thought of how this quiet closeness, felt less like rebellion and more like truth. When Hannah stood to refill her coffee, Grace watched the movement with an intensity that surprised her. The way Hannah's sweater shifted at her shoulders, the familiar curve of her back. It was not hunger exactly. It was recognition. Hannah caught her looking. The pause that followed was small but decisive. Hannah didn't look away. Grace didn't either. The air between them felt charged, as if it had been waiting for this acknowledgement. "Grace," Hannah said softly, not as a question. Grace swallowed. Yes. Hannah set the mug down slowly, deliberately. She didn't move closer. She didn't retreat. If this feels like too much, she said carefully, tell me. Grace felt the words settle, felt the permission embedded within them. She took a breath, deeper this time. It doesn't, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. It feels like something I've been pretending not to notice. Hannah nodded, her expression open, unguarded. She took one step closer, not touching yet, waiting. The crossing came not with urgency but with inevitability. Grace closed the distance herself, her hand lifting before she had fully decided to move it. She stopped, just short of Hannah's arm, giving her time, space. Hannah leaned in, not enough to close the gap, just enough to signal agreement. When Grace's fingers finally rested against Hannah's sleeve, the sensation traveled fast and deep. Fabric first, then warmth. Hannah inhaled sharply, the sound barely audible. They stood like that for a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Grace's hand stayed where it was. Hannah's gaze dropped briefly to it, then lifted again. Consent lived in that glance, in the stillness that followed. Grace leaned in slowly, her forehead resting against Hannah's, the contact gentle, grounding. Their breaths mingled. Grace could feel Hannah's heart beat through the space between them, fast but steady. The kiss, when it came, was restrained. A careful press of lips. A pause. Another, slightly longer. Grace felt the world narrow to sensation, the softness, the warmth, the way Hannah's hand came up to rest lightly at her waist without pulling, without claiming. Grace's body responded before her thoughts caught up. A rush of heat. A tremor she hadn't expected. She stayed inside it, resisting the urge to move faster, to deepen the contact. The restraint felt important. Sacred even. When they separated, it was by mutual instinct. Grace stepped back first, her hand dropping, her breath uneven. Hannah followed the movement, giving her space without retreating entirely. They didn't speak right away. The room felt altered, slightly misaligned, as if something fundamental had shifted without disturbing the furniture. The clock on the wall ticked. A car passed outside. Somewhere, someone laughed. Grace pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling the echo of what had happened. It wasn't guilt that rose up. It was fear, not of Hannah, not of desire, but of the clarity that followed. Hannah watched her closely. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. Grace nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't regret it." Hannah smiled, small and understanding. She didn't move to touch her again. She didn't need to. They spent the rest of the afternoon together in a strange, tender suspension. They cooked dinner, standing on opposite sides of the counter, glancing at each other more often than necessary. Every movement carried memory now. Every brush of fabric against skin felt heightened. The world went on. Grace's parents returned. Conversation resumed. Plates were passed. Grace answered questions automatically, her body still humming with the aftershock of the kiss. Later, when Hannah left, the goodbye lingered. They stood on the porch, the evening air cool against warm skin. Hannah leaned in, pressing a brief, gentle kiss to Grace's cheek, a gesture so careful it felt almost reverent. "Thank you," Hannah said, not explaining for what. Grace watched her go, her heart unsteady, her thoughts fractured. Inside, something repeated, insistent and irreversible. "It has happened. It has happened. It has happened." And nothing, no prayer, no restraint, could make it unhappen. The next days carried weight differently. Grace felt it the moment she woke, an ache that wasn't pain exactly, but pressure. As if something inside her had shifted position and hadn't settled yet. The memory of Hannah's mouth, the careful restraint of it, the way it had ended before either of them lost control, replayed without warning, not as a scene, as a sensation. She lay still, listening to the house breathe around her. Pipes clicking. A door closing somewhere down the hall. The familiar sounds felt strangely distant, as though she were hearing them from another room. After that kiss, Nothing had been said that could be taken back, and nothing had been said that explained it either. Grace moved through the morning deliberately. She washed her face with water that felt too cold. She dressed slowly, choosing clothes that felt like armor, long sleeves, high collar. She paused at the mirror, fingers hovering over the cross at her throat, then left it where it was. The metal pressed lightly against her skin, grounding and accusatory all at once. Hannah didn't come that day. Grace hadn't expected her to. She told herself that over and over. Of course Hannah wouldn't come. They hadn't made plans. They hadn't agreed on anything. They had kissed and then let the world continue, as if that were enough to contain it. Still, the absence felt loud. At breakfast, her mother talked about church events, about a fundraiser, about a couple who had announced their engagement. Grace nodded in the right places, responded with practiced ease. Inside, her thoughts broke into fragments. What had she done? What had she not done? What did it mean if Hannah stayed away? She carried dishes to the sink, rinsed them carefully, watching the water bead and slide over porcelain. The repetition steadied her. She stayed there longer than necessary, hands submerged, letting the cold numb her fingers. Later, she went into town for errands she didn't need. The grocery store. The post office. Ordinary places that had never felt dangerous before. She half expected to see Hannah everywhere, in the reflection of a window, turning a corner, standing just out of sight. Each time she didn't, her chest tightened slightly, then loosened. The world continued, indifferent to the quiet rupture forming inside her. The afternoon, Hannah finally came. Not with a knock, with a text. I'm outside. If that's okay. Grace stared at the screen, the words simple, careful. Consent again, woven into the waiting. She sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, her pulse loud in her ears. She could say no. She could delay. She could pretend she hadn't seen it yet. She stood instead. At the door she paused, her hand hovering over the handle. Her body felt alert, tense, as if bracing for impact. When she opened it, Hannah stood a step back from the threshold, her hands in her pockets, her expression open but cautious. "Hey," Hannah said. "Hey," Grace replied. They didn't hug. They didn't move closer. The space between them felt intentional, fragile. Inside, they sat at opposite ends of the couch. The distance was small, but it felt enormous. Grace folded her hands together, her fingers whirring at each other unconsciously. Hannah watched the movement, then looked away, giving her privacy even in silence. They talked about nothing at first. The weather, a mutual acquaintance, a book Hannah had been reading. Their voices were careful, quieter than necessary. Each word felt like it had been weighed before being spoken. Grace listened, but part of her remained elsewhere, tracking every shift in Hannah's posture, every pause. She noticed the restraint in Hannah's movements, the way she didn't lean in, the way she kept her hands to herself. It was kindness. It was distance. It hurt more than either alone. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. It stretched, thick and charged. Grace felt her thoughts fragment, scatter. Fear crept in, not of Hannah, but of herself, of what she might say if she let herself speak honestly. "I've been thinking," Grace began, then stopped. Hannah looked at her, attentive but not expectant. "You don't have to," she said softly. That was the problem. Grace wanted to. She just didn't know how. They sat with it, the unspoken weight pressing in. Grace's body registered the absence before her mind did, the lack of touch, the space where Hannah's warmth had been before. Her shoulders felt tight. Her breath stayed shallow. Outside, a lawnmower started up. The sound cut through the tension, grounding them momentarily in the world beyond the room. Grace focused on it, on the mundane persistence of it. "I don't regret it," Grace said suddenly, the words escaping before she could reconsider. Hannah didn't respond immediately. She nodded once slowly. "Neither do I." The relief was brief. It didn't resolve anything. It just clarified the terrain. Grace stood and went to the kitchen, needing movement, needing something to do with her hands. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, the familiar routine offering temporary shelter. Hannah joined her a moment later, standing at a careful distance. They moved around each other without touching, a choreography born of restraint. Grace reached for mugs. Hannah opened a cabinet, then paused, letting Grace pass first. Each small courtesy carried weight. In the quiet, Grace's thoughts turned sharper. What would her parents say if they knew? What would the church say? What would God say if she dared to ask directly? The fear wasn't abstract. It was intimate, personal, tied to faces and voices she loved. "I don't know how to be this," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hannah leaned against the counter, her expression gentle but serious. "I know," she said, "and I'm not asking you to decide anything right now." Grace turned to look at her. "But you were here." "Yes," Hannah said simply. "If that's okay." Grace felt the weight of that word. Okay. Settle again. Permission. Choice. Responsibility. They carried their mugs back to the living room, sat again at opposite ends of the couch. The distance remained. Grace wrapped both hands around her mug, feeling the heat seep into her palms, anchoring her. Time passed. The afternoon light shifted, dimmed. Grace's parents would be home soon. The world would resume its usual demands. Hannah stood first, setting her mug down. "I should go," she said, not as an ultimatum, just as fact. Grace nodded. Her chest felt tight, constricted. She walked Hannah to the door, each step deliberate. At the threshold they paused again, the moment suspended. Hannah reached out, then stopped herself, her hand hovering between them. She looked at Grace, searching her face. "Tell me if you want me to stay," she said quietly, "or if you want me to leave." The choice hung there, unfinished, heavy. Grace felt it stretch inside her, pulling in opposite directions. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The door remained open. The space between them remained unfilled. The decision remained unspoken. Grace stayed where she was, her hand still resting on the edge of the open door, the cool air from outside brushing against her wrist. Hannah's hand remained suspended between them, neither retreating nor advancing. The moment stretched, elastic and unforgiving, full of everything Grace had not said yet. Her heart beat steadily, almost calmly, as if it had already accepted whatever came next. It was her mind that resisted, pulling in fragments of sermons, expectations, half-remembered warnings. But underneath all of that, quieter and more persistent, was something else, a recognition that refusing to choose was itself a choice she had made too many times before. She inhaled slowly. She felt the weight of the cross at her throat, warm against her skin, familiar. It did not feel like a barrier. It felt like a witness. "Stay," Grace said. The word didn't arrive dramatically. It came out level, almost soft. But it changed everything. Hannah's shoulders loosened at once, as if she had been holding herself in check with deliberate effort. Her hand lowered, not touching yet, simply closing the distance that had existed a moment ago. She nodded once, her expression careful, reverent, as if she understood the gravity of what had been offered. They closed the door together. Inside, the house felt different again, not charged this time, but attentive, as though it were holding its breath with them. Grace leaned back against the door, suddenly aware of her own body, of how close Hannah stood now. Not pressing, not claiming, just present. They didn't kiss. They moved to the living room instead, sat side by side on the couch with the space between them finally gone. Hannah's thigh rested against Grace. The contact was solid, unmistakable. Grace let herself register it fully. The warmth, the grounding pressure, the sense of alignment it brought. This was the shared moment that allowed truth to surface, not through urgency, but through stillness. Grace stared ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've spent so long asking for things to be taken away from me," she said quietly, as if that was the same as being faithful. Hannah didn't interrupt. She shifted slightly closer, their shoulders touching now, steady and unassuming. "I don't know how to reconcile everything," Grace continued. "I don't know what this means for the life I've built, but I know what it feels like when I'm with you." She turned then, finally meeting Hannah's eyes. "And it doesn't feel like something that needs forgiveness." Hannah's breath caught. She lifted her hand slowly, pausing just short of Grace's arm, waiting. Grace nodded. The touch was gentle. Hannah's fingers rested lightly against Grace's forearm, warm and deliberate. Grace felt it all the way through her, a quiet, spreading sensation that settled rather than flared. She leaned into it without rushing, her body making the decision before her thoughts could complicate it. They kissed again, this time without pulling back as quickly. Still restrained. Still careful. But deeper. Grace felt Hannah's hand move to her waist, anchoring her, asking nothing more than permission to stay. Grace responded by resting her forehead against Hannah's temple, breathing her in. When they separated, they stayed close, foreheads touching, breaths uneven but calming. Clarity came quietly. Not a certainty about the future, but a surrender to the present. Grace didn't need to map out her life to know that this honesty, this presence, was something she could no longer deny. They spent the evening together in simple ways. They made soup from what was already in the fridge. They set the table. They ate slowly, talking about small things, letting the world re-enter gently. Grace noticed how Hannah listened, how she paused before speaking, how she adjusted her movements to Gracie's rhythms. Afterward, they sat on the porch as dusk settled in. Hannah's arm rested along the back of the bench, not around Grace, but there. Grace leaned back into it eventually, her shoulder brushing Hannah's chest. The contact felt unremarkable in the best way, like something that had always belonged. Inside, Grace felt the shift take root. Not excitement, not relief. Something steadier. A sense of permanence forming without fanfare. "I'm scared," Grace admitted softly. "I know," Hannah said, her voice close to Grace's ear. "We can go slowly." Grace nodded. "I don't want to hide." Hannah tightened her arm just slightly, a quiet affirmation. The days that followed were not transformed by spectacle. They were altered by texture. Grace noticed how she moved through familiar spaces with a new awareness, how the church felt heavier now, but also less absolute. How conversations carried subtext she hadn't allowed herself before. How Hannah's presence settled into her routines, sometimes visible, sometimes just felt. They didn't tell anyone right away. They didn't need to. What mattered lived between them, in shared mornings and quiet evenings, in the way Hannah reached for Grace's hand when they crossed the street, then released it before anyone noticed, in the way Grace no longer flinched at the feeling. The world continued. Responsibilities remained. Faith did not disappear, it shifted, becoming something Grace held rather than something that held her. One night, lying side by side, fully clothed, listening to the house settle around them, Grace traced small, absent patterns on Hannah's sleeve. The gesture repeated, unconscious and grounding. "This isn't something I can undo," Grace said quietly. Hannah turned toward her, her gaze steady. "I wouldn't want you to." Grace closed her eyes, letting the words settle, letting the truth of them take root. Love did not arrive as absolution. It arrived as courage, practiced daily. And the question that remained, gentle but insistent, was this: what kind of faith asks you to disappear in order to belong? If this story touched your heart, share your truth in the comments. And if this journey stayed with you, please consider subscribing to Secret Garden Stories, leaving a comment, and sharing it with friends, forums, and social media. Your support helps this channel grow and build a world with more love and less prejudice. Thank you for being here.